Welcome to episode 115 of the G2 on 5G. It's the latest inside scoop on everything 5G. We cover 6 topics in about 20 minutes, and it's brought to you by More Insights and Strategy. I'm Will Townsend, and joining me again this week is fellow analyst Anshel Sag. Let's get started. So for my first topic, I was actually pre-briefed on this, but this week, AT&T and Corning announced a tie-up, and it's aimed at bolstering fiber optic cable supply. And so what does this mean for 5G deployment? Well, obviously, for backhaul, fiber is the best solution. And I've spoken about AT&T's fiber first strategy. They are investing, it's a twofold capability for them. One, it drives significant ARPU for their broadband business, which is over $10 billion in top line revenue, and obviously supports its 5G backhaul. But some of the details on this announcement. I mean, basically, Corning is opening a new facility in Arizona. It's in Gilbert, Arizona. I believe Gilbert is where they have all the minor league near Goodyear, like all the minor league baseball parks. You and I are big baseball fans, so thought I'd mention that. Currently, their fiber plant is in North Carolina, and Corning is the top supplier of fiber optic cable. So putting it in Arizona makes sense just from a kind of a bicoastal perspective. So they expect the new plant to open in 2024, and it allowed about 250 jobs. In concert with that, AT&T also announced plans that they're going to build a new fiber internet network in Mesa. It's going to supply over 100,000 homes, and they expect to have that build out complete by 2023. No dates established there, but it is actually significant because it's AT&T's first fiber network in the state of Arizona. So from my perspective, given all the supply chain constraints that we're seeing, companies like Ciena have recently report poor earnings based on supply chain issues, and obviously that company is a big player in fiber optic cable build out. So I think this is fantastic. But what are your thoughts?
Saw the news that the Corning facility would be deploying AT&T 5G,
Yeah.
and that it would be kind of like another smart manufacturing facility. It's interesting because Corning does a lot of things other than just make fiber optics,
Yeah.
right? They make glass for all kinds of specialized purposes. So it's a key component in a lot of things. And I think it's important to have, you know, cutting edge manufacturing facilities in the US as supply chain becomes more and more challenging. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, I think this is a positive thing for both companies. And, I think it's starting to sound like, these 5G deployments inside factories are becoming more of the usual
Mhm.
rather than the exception.
Yeah. I've spoken to this on past podcasts, but I believe, well over, half of the total addressable market for private cellular will be within manufacturing, to your point, for smart operations, robotic control, any sort of tactile type operation. And this announcement just furthers AT&T's commitment to having a fiber first strategy. So I think it's super solid, and we'll continue to monitor that. And if things progress, we'll report back. But let's move to your first topic this week. We've talked about Reliance in the past and the Indian market. You want to share some details on their 5G standalone network deployment?
Yeah, so this is it's giving me flashbacks to their 4G rollout.
Yeah.
Um, Basically, during the big AGM that Reliance has, which is like their big shareholder meeting,
Yeah.
the CEO basically, gives like his state of the union for the company over the next year. And one of the big things he said is that they're going to invest $25 billion as a single
Wow.
company to roll out their 5G network across India, which is a considerable amount of money when you
Yes.
consider that, um, they plan to have nationwide coverage by the end of 2023. So, they're going to obviously deploy in highly dense areas first, big population centers, and then move outward. But this is a standalone 5G network, so they will
Mhm.
not be using NSA, which, like I said, gives me flashbacks to their 4G network, which was also not dependent on 3G whatsoever, and
Yeah.
actually allowed them to, I think, grow a lot faster than their competitors.
Yeah.
And it allowed them to deploy new use cases faster. So,
Yeah.
um, I think this will be really interesting to see how it rolls out, how much coverage and how many users they're able to potentially serve by the end of 2023.
Yeah.
But they say that it has the potential of connecting up to 100 million homes with fixed broadband as well. So um, there's a lot of things that I think are riding on this network.
Yeah.
But I do think that it will, you know, I think it will be limited in scope. Even by the end of 2023, I think there's probably a limited number of users they can reach until they start, deploying things like satellite 5G and other types of broad coverage technologies. Because
Mhm.
um, while Reliance has a lot of different spectrum, none of that spectrum I think will necessarily serve rural areas particularly well,
Yeah.
um, because it's just India is a huge country,
Yeah.
and there's going to be a lot of dead zones. There probably still are with 4G. So, my expectations with 5G are pretty similar. That you're going to get lots of coverage in populous centers, and then it probably drops off pretty quickly, and it'll take time to build that out. But
Mhm.
um, it's still very ambitious. It's a lot of money,
Yeah.
and I think they've already signed a lot of the agreements that are necessary to get the equipment that they need to make this happen.
Yeah, I'm really surprised at the price tag, because if you think about that market in ARPU to retire that NRE and that capital expense, I mean, that's a tidy sum. Obviously, they've been very focused. They've had the flexibility with their LTE greenfield deployment to do things with disaggregated RAN and that sort of thing. So for them to go straight to standalone is super aggressive. I think it might also be a competitive, ploy, if you want to call it that, or strategy to sort of, outsmart, outbest their competitors, because the mobile market, the mobile network operator market in India is quite competitive. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how this progresses. So, but let's move to my second topic this week. And we actually have bookend topics here for both of our second. We're going to talk about the recent 2.5 gigahertz auction. I want to talk about Verizon. And our friend Mike Dano at Light Reading, he published an article this week. And the subject was, did Verizon accidentally spend $1.5 million on 2.5 gigahertz spectrum assets? And so that appears to be what has happened. Many analysts, including myself, have concluded that this was probably Verizon's attempt to try to spike the price up for T-Mobile, and you're going to talk about T-Mobile in a moment. But as you and I have talked about on prior podcasts, that didn't happen. I mean, this auction landed at a fairly reasonable level. And what's interesting, Verizon ended up with 12 licenses across 9 counties, and it's really weird because it was very widely dispersed. It's also strange because Verizon isn't deploying in the 2.5 gigahertz band as well. So clearly, and then there was an attempt for them to, to kind of claw this back, because as we've discussed, these operators that participate in these auctions have to put down pretty hefty sums of money from a deposit perspective. But it was clear, because AT&T only put down 1,000, that they weren't really going to seriously participate in the auction, because they've shored up their mid-band licenses pretty well with the 110 spectrum and that sort of thing. But what are your thoughts?
Not surprised this happened. It kind of reminds me of one of those auctions where somebody holds up a paddle accidentally, and they end up buying something they didn't have any interest in because they were just
Right,
running up the price.
right,
That's kind of the mental image I have in my head. Um, you know, it's up to the operators, to deploy whatever strategy they want, to make these auctions more expensive for their competitors. This sounds like it could be a slight case of sour grapes considering how much Verizon paid for their spectrum.
Right.
And I'm, probably not surprised that what they paid for that spectrum probably had a lot to do with T-Mobile and AT&T bidding as well.
Yeah.
Um, that said, I think that auction was a much more competitive auction
Hmm.
um, between the three carriers than this was. And I think that's probably why Verizon tried to bid it up a bit
Yeah.
because a lot of other analysts expected this to be in the billions of dollars in terms of
Yeah.
auction. But you and I both agreed this was going to be a pretty low bid auction. I would have been surprised if this crossed $500 million.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I was honestly 428 million is higher than I was expecting. But
Hmm.
um, a lot of these are rural licenses, so there are not that many people that are being served by each one. So
Yeah.
per user, these are actually a lot more expensive than some of the other auctions that we've seen. So I'll do the math later on and see what the end result is, because I think we have to look and see how many users are in each county. But I would expect that these licenses are fairly expensive just because they're not very populous areas, and I think it's kind of unfortunate that someone like Verizon might want to try and drive up the cost of you know
Yeah.
covering rural users when it's already the economics of it are already quite poor.
Yeah. No, and you already started kind of addressing, your book end of this topic. Um, it was like 91%, right, of the licenses T-Mobile captured, right?
Yeah, so I'll we'll just kind of wind into mine. So the auction closed at $428 million.
Yeah.
T-Mobile got something in the ballpark of like 7,100 or 7,200 of all 8,000 licenses, which puts them about 91% of all licenses.
Hmm.
So T-Mobile alone is paying $300 million out of the $400 million in this auction, meaning that the remaining $100 million were 9% of the other licenses, um, which means that those were probably the most competitive ones. Um, and it's possible that T-Mobile had some competitive ones as well. But yeah, it seems like out of that auction, some of that's also Verizon's.
Yeah. Yeah. 1.5 million worth for sure. Cool. Well, let's move to my third and final topic for this Labor Day weekend special podcast. So I want to talk about Ericsson, and they've launched a new triple band 5G radio, and I want to share what's compelling about that. So this is the radio 6646. Sounds like a Van Halen or a Van Hagar album. But what's significant is Ericsson claims that it's capable of doing the job of 9 radios while cutting energy consumption by 40%. And it weighs 60% less than comparable solutions. And that's significant, right? So power, form factor, it's quite compelling. So the specs on it are, it's low band, so it's 900, 800, and 700 megahertz frequency bands, and you can do carrier aggregation. And the other thing to note is that, and you're pretty technical, and you kind of dig into this sort of stuff, but the 700 megahertz band, and I didn't know this until I caught the news. It's it's well positioned for 5G standalone use. And I would love for you to share your perspective on why that's the case, because that was something that I learned.
So what's interesting is, first of all, you said this is a low band, deployment.
Yeah.
What's interesting is a lot of the Ericsson announcements we've seen, um, they, first of all, a lot of them are focused on power consumption.
Yeah.
And I think these ones they're claiming are 40%, reduction in power consumption and 60% reduction in weight,
Yeah.
which I think is a big deal because these are pretty big elements. The lower the frequency, the larger the element has to be. Um, and I think when it comes to this specific band with 700, um, it's really good for enabling coverage. Obviously 600 is better,
Yeah.
but 700 is like globally harmonized as a coverage band.
Okay.
Um, and 600 isn't, even though 600 is going to be a much better propagating band for that.
Mhm.
But these are also, smaller blocks of frequency. So you're not really going to want to use them for throughput. And primarily, you're going to want to have these bands for uplink.
Yeah.
Um, and since, having 700 megahertz, if you allocate enough to the uplink, you get, good coverage on 700. It actually improves your coverage in a lot of the mid bands that you would aggregate with it, with standalone. So
Yeah.
we could see improved standalone coverage with 700 megahertz being leveraged as the, uplink carrier.
Yeah.
So that way, people get better battery life, better coverage,
Yeah.
and better overall performance on all their bands.
Yeah. I just found it was interesting that, Ericsson's positioning this, as ideally suited for, for SA deployments, obviously with
That's
broader.
why, for
Yeah.
as a carrier aggregation play,
Yeah. There you
kind of
go.
using the low band as the uplink to
Yep.
and the
Yeah.
coverage of the downlink.
Yeah. And I'll also mention too that in the announcement, Telefonica is actually using this new radio, and so it'll be interesting to kind of keep tabs on Telefonica and their experience with that, and if things develop, report back on a future podcast. But with that, let's round it out and hit your third and final topic. And I caught this week, but ARM is suing Qualcomm, and you want to share your perspective on what's going on there.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting situation because Qualcomm is easily one of ARM's biggest customers.
Yeah.
Um, they have one of the deepest license agreements um, possible with ARM. They have custom core architecture licenses. They have semi-custom core architecture. They've got full IP. So they're one of biggest ARM's biggest customers, and it, basically Qualcomm went out and acquired Nuvia,
Yeah.
which is a CPU design startup for ARM cores. And ARM is suing Qualcomm and Nuvia simultaneously, even though Nuvia is already an absorbed entity of Qualcomm.
Yeah.
And they're saying that Qualcomm did not get permission to transfer Nuvia's ARM license, um, which is an interesting problem because um, there's going to be some contractual arguments about whether or not Qualcomm needs to transfer Nuvia's ARM license when they already hold one, and
Right.
arguably a much larger, more encompassing license.
Yeah.
Um, and ARM is also suing them for using the ARM trademark, which is a weird one. I have a feeling that's also like a contractual transferal agreement thing. But what I think is it really fundamentally interesting here is um, a lot of companies are already kind of questioning the state of ARM because of the originally intended acquisition of ARM by NVIDIA.
Right.
So a lot of companies, once that happened, started to take RISC-V a lot more seriously. And I think that this lawsuit by ARM is only going to push more vendors in the direction of RISC-V. And I think a big reason for that is I don't really think ARM needed to sue Qualcomm here.
Yeah.
And I think the reason why they did has a lot more to do with all the things that are happening in the background around Nuvia and
Yeah.
how Samsung signed a new agreement with Qualcomm, deepening its relationship with Qualcomm
Right.
across more categories and absorbing more Qualcomm SoCs within their existing categories. So that is a big deal because Samsung is a licensee of ARM, and if they are no longer licensing ARM cores, they're just buying them from Qualcomm, and Qualcomm starts making Nuvia cores. That's less licensing revenue for ARM. So
Exactly.
if Qualcomm continues to absorb more customers that originally were, doing ARM licenses, this could be something that could have triggered something like this. And I think that there is definitely some strained relationship between ARM and Qualcomm that I
Yeah.
think a lot of people maybe haven't seen. But I do think the acquisition of Nuvia is a big part of that because There's a lot of rumors that Qualcomm went out and bought Nuvia because they weren't necessarily pleased with the performance that ARM was giving them in their cores.
Yeah.
And Nuvia is supposed to be much better,
Yeah.
according to a lot of people. And if it is better than ARM and faster and can actually compete with Apple, then that kind of makes ARM and a lot of its partners look bad. So
Yeah.
it's a very complicated political scenario, but ultimately it comes down to the fact that Nuvia is supposed to be a very competitive product. And it's going to, potentially bring Qualcomm back into the server market as well, which is another thing that I think people should consider is, ARM has a very big growth opportunity with servers that they're starting to realize this year after many years of trying. And, if Nuvia is faster on the server side as well, that might also be a reason why ARM, might be trying to squash this.
Yeah.
And in the complaint, they actually explicitly state that they want to destroy certain Nuvia designs. They use the word destroy. So I think that this is very much about Nuvia's competitiveness with ARM's cores more than anything else.
Yeah. I think that's great insight, bud. The other thought that came to my mind is that, with that acquisition deal off and ARM trying to, make itself look pretty for an IPO, is this a way to signal to the market that they have intellectual property that is valuable? So like you said, there are a lot of politics involved in all of this, and I'm sure this story will continue to go on. But hey, it's been another great podcast this Labor Day weekend. Why don't you take us home?
Absolutely. We hope our viewers and listeners found this week's topics interesting. If anyone out there would like to provide insights on a specific 5G topic for a future podcast, please reach out to us on social media. Will is at Whaletown Tech, and I'm at Anshel. We hope you have a great weekend, and please tune in again next week.